And I like this, because there's an action verb there, challenging Islamophobia. And so I'd encourage all of us, I encourage myself and each one of you to think about the verb here. What is it, the action? What is the action that we are, if I may use this term, called to incorporate in our own lives? And that's what I will be thinking about as we go through the day today. So this first plenary panel is about how Islamophobia became mainstream, which is an interesting question. I can tell you that Hubert Humphrey, when he visited Mogadishu in 1968, talked about the potential concerns of Islamophobia in the world. So think about that. Think about where we are today. We have 4 remarkable panelists. Here's what we're going to do. I will come up and introduce each one of them very briefly. They will speak for about 10 minutes and then probably take a seat back down here until everybody's spoken, and then we'll all come up and we'll have a moderated conversation after you hear from all of them. And we've got a timekeeper to keep these folks really crisp so that we can maximize the amount of time we have for your questions. You all have note cards, or should have note cards. If you don't, there might be some coming around. We'll take your questions on note cards. That way we can cluster questions if there's more than one about a specific topic. The questions will come up to me, and then I will pose the questions to the panelists. Got that? So our first speaker is Corey Saylor, who is the Managing Director of Security and Rights at Rethink Media. In this role, he works with a specialized team of communications professionals to protect human and civil rights in a post-9/11 world. He has spent over 20 years in nonprofit advocacy, working on political communications, media relations, and combating anti-Islam prejudice in the United States. Please welcome to the podium Corey Saylor.
Good morning. I want to thank CARE Minnesota for a first. Usually I'm the first speaker after lunch when everybody is tired and sleepy. And here I stand after caffeine. I don't know quite what to do. Everybody's going to be attentive. I'm going to have to sound intelligent. So let's give it a shot. There was a moment documented by historian Stephen Ambrose in his book Citizen Soldiers. And it's in Texas during the Second World War, and a train pulls up to a stop. And already here, present at this stop, were a number of African-American GIs who were there to get their lunch. And as was the way things were done in the South at that point in time, these GIs were sitting out back of the restaurant. This train let out a number of German POWs who had been brought to the United States to work our farms while our soldiers were overseas fighting. And those German POWs, along with their American captors who were keeping an eye on them, proceeded to go into the restaurant and eat sandwiches and coffee. And one of the African-American GIs wrote a letter to one of the military publications at the time, pointing out that, hey, I'm like serving the country and I have to sit out back, and this guy who is technically our enemy is inside eating these wonderful sandwiches. At that same moment in history, a few thousand miles away, Americans of Japanese ancestry were sitting in camps where our government had placed them under suspicion that they might turn against us during the war. So when we ask ourselves the question, how did Islamophobia become mainstream? One of the first things we have to acknowledge is this kind of stuff has been here. And I think everybody in this room knows that other communities have faced this challenge throughout the history of this country, and that in many ways the systems were already in place for Islamophobia, if its moment arose, to become something that was mainstream and unfortunately fairly normalized. But I want to not dwell on that point too much, because I think that's something that's fairly commonly known. Even if we don't sort of at the front of our heads realize it, we know these structures are in place that empower certain groups I might be part of one of those groups, over others. And I can tell you, I've seen it, experienced it. When I first converted to Islam, I changed my name to an Arabic-sounding name, and even that gave me a glimpse into the treatment of people whose names sound different. I've also frequently been told to go back to my own country, and then I say that means I have to go back to Virginia, Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. That kind of confuses people. But for Islamophobia, there's a different moment that I want to talk to you about. And this moment was in 2010. And it happened in New York. A few months earlier, a group had announced a project that they called the Cordoba Project. And my guess is very few people, you guys don't respond because I know you know. Anybody ever heard of the Cordoba Project? It's not bad, a couple. You'll know about it in a second. I'll use a different name and everybody will know it. They announced this project where they were going to build a community center in Lower Manhattan. And this community center was going to have an Islamic place of worship and a number of other things. Front page, New York Times article, below the fold. Nobody responded to the article. It was a very interesting thing, and it was, a piece about something positive going on. Laura Ingraham, who was a conservative radio show host at the time, had one of the sponsors of the program on her program, talked to the sponsor of the program, and at the end of the conversation said, "I like what you're trying to do." Shortly after that, a woman named Pamela Geller inserted herself into the conversation. And she took the name Cordoba Project and turned it into the Ground Zero Mosque. How many people have heard of that? Right? Brilliant piece of rebranding we have to acknowledge. That became a campaign issue, and all of a sudden this thing that started off as a, "hey, I like what you're doing," became a flashpoint on the campaign trail where there's ads going out about this victory mosque that the Muslims were planning down near the World Trade Center site. Things went out like, it's a violation of our values and it's a desecration of sacred ground, even though there was a strip joint closer to Ground Zero, even though there was already a mosque in that area. And I bring this moment to you because in my mind, that is when the anti-Muslim network in the United States won its first real major victory. And I know that because every time I ask, do you know Cordoba Project? Nobody knows it. Do you know Ground Zero Mosque? Everybody, most of the room knows it. So when we talk about Islamophobia becoming mainstream, we already know these structures were in place, but there's a few other things that contribute to it. And one of them is this Islamophobia network that exists, these groups that are around simply to demonize people of the Muslim faith. They have great reach. We'll discuss it at length throughout the day. But I just want to make, for you right now, I want to make sure you're aware that this network exists. The other three things that I want to talk about that contribute to Islamophobia becoming mainstream, the media, without a doubt. Some of our colleagues recently did a study of media reporting on incidents in which the perpetrator of some violent act was perceived as Muslim, and they found that the media covers that at least 2 times when it's compared to the same kind of incident and the perpetrator is not someone who's perceived to be Muslim. And I even find, from my experience, I even find the 2 times number to be less. But some of the other things that they found is that if you're perceived as being Muslim, the Department of Justice is 6 times more likely to issue a press release about the episode. If you're perceived as being Muslim, weapons of mass destruction charges are more than 3 times likely. So the media is giving oxygen to this narrative that Muslims are inclined toward violence. And when you live in a situation where 6 in 10 Americans acknowledge that they don't know a Muslim personally, where do you get your information from? And that's what you're going to see. So this conversation here today, which will be productive and we'll talk about solutions, is never going to make it onto TV. If some crazy guy in a cave in Afghanistan yells "death to America," guaranteed a week at least in the news cycle. The other thing that contributes to it is politicians. Do I really need to go into that too much? Good. I've figured not. But here's the point that I want to make about it, because this is an election year. One of our colleagues, Dalia Mogahed, looked at increases in anti-Muslim sentiment, and what she found is that it goes up more in relation to election cycles than it does to incidents that are in the news. So as we move into the midterm election, I can pretty much guarantee you that you will start to see more and more politicians deploying anti-Muslim sentiment as a way to generate attention to themselves. In my own research, what I found is it doesn't really win you votes, but it gets you money. It gets you money and attention. And hey, I don't want to talk about balancing the budget. You should be afraid of those Muslim dudes, right? It gives me something to talk about that sort of allows me to get away with making you afraid and making you feel like something has to be done about an issue and not talk about some of the more substantive things. And then the last of the things that we have to acknowledge before we start switching to solutions is the reality that violent extremist groups that claim that Islam sanctions their actions contribute to Islamophobia. There's no doubt about it in my mind. And I don't think anybody in the room would argue with me on that. Quite fortunately, ISIS is broken at this point, and we will see what happens. Will they reformulate somewhere else? Or can we start putting this devil-inspired, vile movement in the rearview mirror and start moving forward from it? Certainly, I'm hoping for, let's put it in the rearview mirror and get moving on. But to not acknowledge the impact that those groups has had, I think, would be to not to have a complete conversation. So before I start depressing the room too much, and since you're caffeinated, you're actually hearing it, and it can have an impact on you, I want to point something out to you. The subjects that we're going to discuss today can be very difficult to hear. When you hear about the individual human suffering because of Islamophobia, people who have, simply because they were walking down the street and looked different, been beaten up, people who are in dire need of medical attention, who simply can't get into the country because of the way they pray. These things are really difficult to hear. But on the other side, I would offer up to you the Catholic community, the American Jewish community, African Americans, Japanese Americans, all these other groups that we can list on and on and on who have gone through the same experience. And it gives me 2 points of hope. One, we can't be self-centered as Muslims and go, oh, everybody's picking on us. They're not. They're just singling us out at certain times. It's an across-the-board problem, which to me gives us an opportunity. Because if Islam, when you take Sharia, a term that's really frightening to many people, when you take it and boil it down, it says, be a service to humanity, avert harm from humanity. Not worry about your own issues. So if all these other communities are facing issues, it's a chance for us to serve and show the Islam that we know and practice. It's also a chance for us to recognize that 100 years ago, the things written about Muslims are exactly like what you would have seen written about Catholics. Pre-Civil War, when you look at some of the stuff, even up to, Kennedy's running for office, well, we can't have a Catholic as a president, the Pope will take over. Romney, I remember going on TV to do an interview because we can't have a Mormon running the country. Somebody was arguing that against him. So when you look at these things, you see that other communities have overcome. Will discrimination go away 100%? No. I don't think that's ever going to be the case. But do we as a nation, do we as people living in Minnesota have an opportunity to essentially erode these things so that we can live that ideal that I learned in middle school, where they taught me we as Americans judge people based on individual merit, not based on characteristics. I 100% believe in that. That's why I show up to work every day, even though the stuff can be depressing. So I'm glad you chose to show up today, because my prayer and hope is after you've listened to my colleagues this morning and we start the breakout sessions, you will hear how you can be part of changing things so that we can live in a country and in a society where people are judged on individual merit, where everybody is treated equally under the law, and we become that beacon to the world that we want to be in our own values. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Professor Hatem Bazian, who is Provost, Co-founder, and Professor of Islamic Law and Theology at Zaytuna College, the first accredited Muslim liberal arts college in the United States. In addition, Professor Bazian is a lecturer in the departments of Near Eastern and Ethnic Studies at UC Berkeley. Dr. Bazian also has served as an adjunct professor of law at Boalt Hall School of Law at the University of California, Berkeley as well. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bazian.
Good morning, and thank you, Dean Bloomberg. I'm just trying to get the projection. So my work on Islamophobia is through the, well, what's going on? My work on Islamophobia covers the full spectrum. I run the Islamophobia Studies Center at UC Berkeley. We published the Islamophobia Studies Journal, the only journal on the subject of Islamophobia globally. Also, I run a whole host of conferences across the globe. I just came back from France. We run conferences in Europe, in the US, in India, and a variety of places. So Islamophobia is a global phenomenon. I'd like to start by quoting Martin Luther King from his speech, The Three Evils of Society. Cowardice as the question, is it safe? Expediency as the question, is it politic? Vanity as the question, is it popular? But conscience as the question, is it right? And on some positions, it is necessary for the moral individual to take a stand that is neither safe, nor politic, nor popular, but he must do so because it's right. So we need to take a stand against Islamophobia because it is right. Considering at this time that many people try to position themselves, whether it's popular, politic, or can put them in a position to get their career forward. Now, it's important to begin with a definition of Islamophobia. And if you notice, the definition that we use at UC Berkeley has nothing to do with Muslims. I argue that Islamophobia has nothing to do with Muslims. It is about commodification of the Muslims for particular purposes, but it definitely has nothing to do with the Muslim. In the same way, racism against African Americans have nothing to do with the African American, him or herself. It is actually the person who's projecting racism. The problem is with them, and they should see a psychiatrist rather than projecting it on the other. Now, I argue that Islamophobia is a new signpost for overt racism, which I maintain created a new rationale for more intense, violent racism toward African Americans, Latinos, and minorities in general. You could actually make a straight line between the increased intensification of Islamophobia and Charlottesville. They're connected because, as we know, racists, even though they oppose affirmative action, they're equal opportunity in actually being racist toward everyone. So again, this is the contradiction in terms of epistemology. This is what some Muslim center received after the election of Trump. So again, there's a new sheriff in town. And it's important that when our civic leaders give airspace and begins to say there's decent people among neo-Nazis that are marching and walking the streets and continue to target individuals, this tells you that we have crossed a path toward overt racism in the country, and that's where we are at this point. We have to understand the problem. We have a political party, again, this is not a partisan, but we have a political party that have actually hitched its wagon to Islamophobia. And I'll get into why Islamophobia as part of a political strategy works. We call it wedge issues. In California, we had made career on it with Proposition 187, 209, and so on. So the Republican Party has hitched its wagon to Islamophobia. The Republicans using Islamophobia as a wedge issue, monetizing Islamophobia into votes at the ballot box. Now, in our work in Europe, Islamophobia intensifies during election cycles. And the party that is leaning to the right, that is outside of power, uses Islamophobia to come back into power. So again, Islamophobia is part of an election campaign for the right-leaning political party that is outside of power, using Islamophobia to get into seats of power. Now, Trump voters, just a recent research, were driven by fear of losing status, not economic anxiety. This is just a recent research. And again, our argument often is that loss of jobs in Michigan, in Ohio, but actually what we find is that the anxiety about losing status as the country is changing, and I heard that here in Minnesota there is some of that same rumblings taking place because there's an increasing number of diverse communities where Minnesota was 97% white, and now they're becoming a little bit more diverse, which means that more suntan is actually very positive that is occurring. So, and again, another beyond economics, fears of cultural displacement pushed whites, the white working class to Trump, meaning voting against their own economic interests. And that's actually important because it has to change how we strategize, thinking of only economic terms rather than to think about people and where their status and where they feel their position within the society. Monetizing Islamophobia, again, the ballot box in the UK. The same research that we have in the US, in the Brexit, it has nothing to do with the economic weaknesses, actually had to do with anti-immigrant sentiment and where people feeling about immigration and their status. So, and people are finding out now some of the counties that were benefiting tremendously from being part of the European Union, actually finding out that for voting for Brexit, they're losing their status and their economic position. The open season on Islamophobia gets mom to take their children to mosque and live stream their hate-filled tirade, meaning that the audacity of racism have become wide open. When a mother takes her children to actually go into a racist tirade in a mosque, that we have crossed into a different period in our country, and we need to be aware of it. I argue that Islamophobia had tipped toward violence. Is no longer only about people expressing their uncomfortable attitude. Is actually an open season, and we already witnessed, at least in the last report, that we have militarized protests in front of Muslim centers. That is a new dimension, a new phenomena that we're experiencing. The intensification of hate groups around the country, 917, this is by Southern Poverty Law Center that maps out the hate groups. So we're experiencing a phenomenon not only of Muslims, but for also others. We're seeing the American Freedom Defense Initiative putting these ads in buses in various parts of the country, whether in New York, San Francisco, Seattle, and other places, meaning that the audacity of racism is out in the open, which requires for us as a civil society to respond as well, to confront it and to counter it. Targeting academia. This is David Horowitz's book on the professors. When he published this book, and this is again where we see the mainstreaming of Islamophobia. You go to the airports, and this book actually is in bookstores in the airports and in many of the book centers across the country, which means there is a relationship between those who spew Islamophobia and racism and the marketing agencies that are taking place. Because as you know, I'm an academic, and we have many academics in here. It's not easy to get your book to be sold on airport bookshelves. There has to be some sophisticated marketing agency behind you. So we're dealing with a different dimension in relations to Islamophobia and targeting academia, because still academia is one of those areas that we still have people that actually have to have a thesis, that you have to have evidence, that you have to have footnotes, and you can't fake it or have fake news as a way of putting your thesis forward. Because again, so targeting academia is part of a sophisticated campaign to neutralize possibility in an area where we could actually engage in a sophisticated critique, not only of ourselves, but also society in general. Stephen Emerson, the American Jihad, this is actually the grandfather of the Islamophobia work in this country, demonizing Muslims and again saying that there are sleeper cells in America. And I argue that there are sleeper cells, but there are people sleeping, and therefore it's not, I see them all the time in the classroom right in the back. But Stephen Emerson again builds that thesis that we're having, that the Muslims are a threat in this country, and he had a documentary and much of the work. So again, this book, you'll find it in many bookstores available, and Netflix also have the documentary available. So again, Netflix as an area where you have accessibility to entertainment. I would say that racism is not an entertainment. Racism has to be constantly pushed out from mainstream society, so it does not have the oxygen and the airspace. In terms of documentaries, The Terrorist Among Us, Obsession, and Third Jihad. The Obsession is still one of the most expensive production that was used in the 2008 election to try to torpedo the election of Obama. Just 2 weeks before the 2008 election, 28 million copies of this documentary were inserted in the Sunday newspaper in swing states at a cost of $17 million. Now, I don't know about you, I don't have $17 million in my pocket to try to influence elections. So Islamophobia was used to try to actually derail Obama's election in 2008. And I argue that many people wanted to target Obama for his blackness, but they found comfort in using his Muslimness as a signpost for his blackness. They wanted to use the N-word, but they found comfort in using the M-word on him. So, and again, M and N are very close in the alphabet. Now, I don't want to accuse that the Islamophobes or racists have actually articulated the arrangement of the alphabet, but I argue that there was a deep discomfort by a considerable part of the American society toward the first African American winning the election, and therefore it's not surprising that the person who led the birther movement is now in the White House. So you could actually make that line in terms of Islamophobia becoming mainstream, and on top of it you get all this type of materials that becomes popular in various parts of the alt-right. And I don't like to use the alt-right. It's like there's nothing wrong with neo-Nazi. I think that should be the appropriate word. We should not actually use what you call media speak to clean up something that should be called for what it is. When they march in the streets with neo-Nazi, with Nazi flags and insania, they should be called for what it is the neo-Nazi movement that we're seeing not only in here, but we're seeing it in Europe. I don't know, I follow the French political landscape. Marine Le Pen's party, their origin are in neo-Nazi. Her dad, you know, I know that people have many hobbies, but this is a sick hobby. He collects Nazi memorabilia, right? So that's the origin of Marine Le Pen's party in France. The same, the UKIP party in the UK, the Austria party as well, and just recently in Germany, for the first time since the Second World War, a party that has neo-Nazi origins have won seats in the German parliament. You thought that we have locked them up after 1945. They actually coming back on the back of Islamophobia and anti-immigrant discourses. I argue that Obama's speech in Cairo made a link between the domestic and the international, and therefore created an intensification of campaign against Obama to make a link between the domestic and the international. And then immediately we could see the representation of Obama demonized in more ways that you could count. And I think in here one has to make a link between the domestic and the international relative to Obama. And while I concur with Corey that the media focus on Ground Zero Mosque was very important, I think it's preceded by the intensification campaign on Obama in the 2008 and the 2010 midterm election. And then if you read Edward Said in terms of Orientalism and the covering Islam, the Iranian Revolution of 1979 have made considerable impact on shaping our consciousness, or what I call latent Islamophobia that informs manifest Islamophobia. But that's, again, for a scholarly discussion rather than for what we need to undertake. Institutions behind Islamophobia: Stop the Islamization of America, Investigative Project on Terrorism, Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, Front Page Magazine, Act for America, Atlas Shrugged, Terrorism Awareness Project. So there's a whole network of organizations. Right now, we have about 113 different groups that are working on Islamophobia, demonizing Muslims in civil society. And I know I've been given that I have time, so I'm going to run through some of the other materials in order for us. Mercer actually bought $2 million to put ads during this last election using Islamophobia, changing the Hollywood sign, welcome to the United States of Islam, and so on. So demonization is connected to election cycles and election campaign. If anything, you remember from my talk today that Islamophobia is about monetizing fear into votes at the ballot box by right-wing or right-leaning political parties. Right? Monetizing votes at the ballot box by right-leaning political groups and political parties in order to win elections, both in the United States and across many parts of Europe. Now, you asked me about what we need to respond. Let me direct you, again, just one, that Islamophobia is highly gendered. 80% of violent attacks, Islamophobic attacks, target women. But often we actually lose that they are women because when we put the M word on them, they become genderless, right? And I think it's very important that violence against women has to be articulated when we deal with Islamophobia, that it is a woman, it happens to be wearing a hijab or a head cover, but that does not remove her gender. And often those who attack Muslim women are men, which actually has to say something about the continuation of the gender fluidity relative to violence against women. So we need to be aware of that, both in here as well as in Europe. That's the statistics in terms of women. Muslims are unequal citizens. Letty Volb wrote from Bolt Law School about the nature of Muslims' constitutional rights, how they have unequal rights within our system at this point. Islamophobia in Palestine. Again, many of those who advocate for Israel from a right-wing perspective, they think that they're protecting Israel by engaging in Islamophobia. And I think they are mistaken. Energizing the right wing and neo-Nazis is not one way to protect or advocate for Israel. Again, racists are equal opportunity. You scratch the surface behind an Islamophobe, you get an anti-Semite that is just trying to reform themselves by targeting Muslims, then to go back and target Jews again. So again, this is the nature of that. This is not to excuse Sheldon Adelson, Mercer, and others. I think they're mistaken for having a narrow political agenda in this. Let me go through some of these in order to get you. Domestic CVE programs have to be challenged, and challenging Islamophobia, because they actually create the image or the perception that Muslims are uniquely predisposed to violence, even though that, in terms of statistics, Muslims or those who commit violent acts in the United States and in Europe account only for 6% of all violence, from 1980 all the way up to 2014. 6%. 94% of violent attacks and violent terrorist attacks in the United States and Europe have nothing to do with Muslims. But the media, again, overrepresentation creates the problem as such. So we need to change Islamophobia. A threat to society impacts all of society, and healthcare and well-being, educational attainment, domestic and foreign policy, media representation, charitable organization. We're doing research on the impact of Islamophobia on public health. We want to move from only media analysis to looking at the victims of Islamophobia and how, using the similar research that done in African Americans, the impact of racism on them, to actually move to try to deal with how it impacts Muslims. So this, for people who are doing research, and I want to push back, I think looking at training our public health providers, our education, to create a Islamophobic, racism-free classroom. So that's where some of the heavy work needs to be undertaken. Lastly, we actually developed an Islamophobia reporting app. So you actually could report Islamophobic incidents. Because data drives policy. Without data, you can't drive policy. If somebody says, I feel that there is Islamophobia, I can't do much about it, but I need data. And therefore, we are asking people to, if you experience Islamophobia, to report it. You could download it on iPhone or Android and report Islamophobia. It comes both in Arabic and in English, and hopefully we'll be adding other languages as well. To challenge Islamophobia, you have to connect data analysis, data-driven documentation with policy recommendation, and we're coming with a number of these recommendations based on the data. Lastly, you could access the material of the Islamophobia Studies Journal, as well as keep in contact. Sorry for taking too much time, but thanks you for listening.
warned that this would be a tough conversation. Thank you. That was a lot of information and a lot to think about again. Have a conversation. So our third speaker is Rashid Musa, who is the president of Young Muslims in Sweden, SUM, S-U-M. The organization was established in 1992 and brings together local associations run by and for Muslim youth across Sweden. Just parenthetically, I have traveled to Sweden and am very aware of the work that this organization is doing both in Stockholm and in Malmö. The organization currently has 30 local chapters and 5,000 members, which makes it Scandinavia's largest Muslim youth organization. The organization works to give boys and girls from Muslim backgrounds the ability to get organized, engage in social and political justice efforts, and aims to address institutional racism and inaccuracies about Muslim culture. Rashid Musa has been the president of this organization for 4 years. Let's welcome him.
Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. It's a really bad idea to go after Dr. Hatim and Corey. And I'm really privileged to be here today. Thank you very much, Dean Goomberg and Cary, Minnesota. And I just arrived last night after 24 hours of flight and transit and so on, so I'm a bit tired, so you guys have to excuse me. But it was an interesting thing because when I went through the passport control, the guys told me that I didn't look Swedish. And I promised my mother not to provoke anyone, especially not in the United States. But I told him that he doesn't look American either, so. But other than that, I didn't get any special treatments like Dr. Hatim. Yes, how Islamophobia became mainstream? Well, for a European context, we had problem with racism and Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, Afrophobia for a very long time. And Europe is somehow a continent that has been produced racism and across the globe. But for me, I see it as in the 80s, in the 70s, and even early 90s, the hate groups, the people were producing Islamophobia and racism. You could identify them. They were wearing like black jackets, big boots, and they used to shave their heads, and they used to gather around in the cities with Nazi symbols and so on. But many of those groups today are actually elected, and they are wearing suits, and they stopped shaving their hairs for some reason, or heads for some reasons, and they are speaking in a tone that is a bit different. But the message are still the same. Islamophobia, just like any other racism, has its roots. And in Europe, it has its historical roots. We can trace back all the way back to Andalusia, even during the Ottoman Empire, where Muslims were projected as violence, terrorists, and oppressing women, and so on and so on. So it's not a new thing, a new phenomenon. But what is very new is it's become much more mainstream today. You don't have to be a far-right extremist to produce racism or Islamophobia today. And we have actually Labour Party that is running the country in Sweden. The Labour Party is supposed to be a leftist party, but they have a very conservative tone when it comes to immigration. In America, you guys have the Muslim ban, but in Europe, we have an immigration stop. In America, you call it the war on terror, but in Europe, you call it the war on radicalization. So the policies are pretty much the same. And Sweden is actually called the 51st state of America because we consume pretty much the same TV channels, and you know, we have Friends on TV and How I Met Your Mother, and we have Nike and Adidas everywhere. And so when Kanye West are making crazy remarks, we also found out in Sweden through our networks. So somehow Sweden is very close to America, not just the commercial-wise or popular culture, but also in the politics. And Sweden and the rest of Europe sees America as a role model and how to handle some of their issues. Which is crazy, I know. But Sweden is a country, is a very small country. The population is 10 million. We don't have equality data, so we don't register people's race or religion. Actually, the word race has been eliminated by the government on all official documents, because they say that they only believe in the human race. So race doesn't exist. So it's become very difficult for anti-racist movements to actually speak on issues as racism. And the idea of color blindness is also very strong in Sweden. And in Sweden, we only see people, and we see humans. And the thing is a very funny thing is that I was watching the news coverage in Sweden, the public service in Sweden, and they were talking about the riots in Ferguson, and they were using terms as white and black. They were saying institutional racism in America, and so on and so on. But then we had our own riots in one of our local communities, and the language shifted in the same news coverage, and they were talking about Swedish and immigrants, and they were talking about integration problems and not institutional racism. So there is actually an idea that racism doesn't exist in Sweden or in Europe. It's an American problem, and is nothing to do with our domestic policies. But Islamophobia has its cause, its roots, but also its effects. Last year in Sweden, Swedish newspapers and the public service used the word Islam and Muslim 64,000 times. And 90% of the media coverage about Islam and Muslim is negative, is about violence or war. And 1 out of 10 article is about a positive thing. Could you guess what it is? Ramadan. So, in other words, 9 out of 10 times we blow up ourselves, and the other 1 out of 10 times we don't eat. So that's the only coverage about Islam and Muslims we get in Europe. And there's nothing in between. We also have problem with racial segregation in Sweden and also in Europe, and it's very, very actually clear. And for white Swedes, only 3% of the population that are white Swedes actually lives in a poor household, whereas 92% for non-Swedes or people of color. We don't have equality data, so the way we found those statistics by looking at where the parents were born or their parents were born. So that's the only way that we can actually see or measure the racism in Europe, or specifically in Sweden. It's also a growing fear of being identified as Muslim. A lot of young Muslims who are in the politics were elected in municipalities in Sweden last election. We also have election year this year. And many of them have been resigned due to their identity. And there's also an idea that all the Muslim politicians, whether different class backgrounds they have, they somehow try to, there's an idea that they work together and try to infiltrate the system. So if you engage in the civil society, they will say that you are infiltrating the system. But if you don't engage, they will say that you are passive and not contributing to the society. So it's damn if you do and damn if you don't. And we have also an discrimination in the workspace. If there are studies that has been done that if your name is Eric and you will be called upon a job interview, and if your name is Hassan, you will be likely not to be called at all. And it's an interesting thing what Dr. Hatem was saying about the gender aspect. In Europe, there are actually a lot of companies that are promoting a policy that is religious neutrality. That means if there is a Muslim woman wearing the headscarf searching for a job, they could actually say that you may be qualified, but we're not going to hire you because you're using your headscarf. And a condition for that woman to get that job is if she removes her headscarves. And we have a lot of those cases actually in Sweden, and some of them have actually been tested in the court, and all of those sisters have actually lost the court because the Islamophobia has become so mainstream that it's also taken over the court system, which is very, very worrying. And Swedish Muslim women also are at risk being victims of hate crimes in public places, no difference than here. But one thing that is also worrying in Europe, we have a lot of Muslim mosques and community centers that has been destroyed and in different ways. The most common way is actually to set fire on the mosque. And in Sweden, we have 2 imams that has been shot at, and both of them luckily survived. So the society in Europe in general is getting much more violent than before. And there's also this idea, perception that in Europe everybody is very liberal and understanding and have more have a more sense when it comes to these issues. But that is true. People in Europe, or the policymakers in Europe, are very liberal when it comes to environmental issues, but very conservative when it comes to Islamophobia and Muslim issues. And we have also, since in a post-9/11 world, the war on terror has affected the Muslim communities in Europe and also in Sweden. For instance, we have this idea about the radicalization process, that if you are a young man growing beard and going to a mosque, that's a sign of radicalization. And they have just passed through a bill that says that teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers are actually, they have to report if they see some of these signs. And that have led to that a lot of young Muslims in general have been targeted as potential terrorists or potential extremism. And I would like to conclude that, and I'll be talking about more on the panel and a bit later, is that Islamophobia in Europe is also in all-time high rise. And usually, when you have this type of problems in the community, you may think that people are going to organize themselves to counter these issues. But we have witnessed the total opposite in Europe. And as the Islamophobia rises in Europe, and a lot of young Muslims and the Muslim community in general are getting a lot more passive. And that's the most worrying thing about Islamophobia. It scares people to actually engage, because they have to choose between engaging in this issue or they might have to sacrifice a career, a job, or being demonized in media. So a lot of people are just being quiet. And that silence is a huge problem. And because when not enough people are actually standing up and towards this type of problems, then And these people that actually run the Islamophobic agenda are getting much stronger, and they can get through some of those policies that are affecting our everyday lives. So I'll just stop here, and thank you very much, and I will speak to you soon in the panel. Thank you very much.
I am going to pose the first question, and it's sort of it's two parts. You can answer one or both parts of it, and then I want to make an announcement while you're pondering that. In our audience today, I understand that we have educators, we have imams, we have nonprofit leaders, we have members of a range of religious institutions, we have scholars, and I would assume that we have a number of people, I would consider myself in this category, who would desperately like to understand how to be a good ally in this work, because if Islamophobia has become mainstream, then I got to think it takes all of us to make it unmainstream, to use a technical term. So what does it mean? What advice would you give for people who seek to be allies? That's my question. What I'd like to say to all of you, because it's very important to us, it's a part of our norms here at the Humphrey School, when I announced that our fourth speaker couldn't be here, we've had at least two of our panelists talk about issues of gender, and I want you to know that the gentlemen sitting up here now on the stage are the individuals who commented that it's unfortunate because she can't be here that we don't have gender balance on this panel. For those of you who are wondering about that, I just want you to know that they recognize that. It wasn't by design. So this first question, what advice do you have for people who seek to be allies in this work of disrupting the mainstream nature of Islamophobia? Anyone of you? Professor?
Well, let me jump. One, again, I said in the beginning, Islamophobia is not about Muslims. It's about our civil society. So it's not only a problem for Muslims, it's a problem for everyone. And I think once we take that position, then it becomes how we can develop areas to counter this prevailing Islamophobic period that we are in. On the back of Islamophobia, racism has become normalized in society. So one. Second, as an ally, I say you have the constitutional right to actually sometimes not knowing what is taking place and asking the questions that need to be asked. Meaning, being stupid sometimes is an okay understanding as long as you're coming from a sincere place. That don't be shy of asking the questions, because we're dealing with cultures and societies that are coming from a variety of backgrounds. So I think to create the space where those questions could be asked in a sincere way. Third, that sometimes allyship does not mean that to show up in the protest, but actually to use your existing skills, talents, and abilities. For example, when we talk to the Catholic Charities, they have been doing some tremendous work in relations to immigration and immigrant settlements. I said that why don't you take some Muslims into your Catholic charity just to show them and to develop, because you have had a longer period of expertise in doing this. So actually that would be a way for expressing an allyship through transferring existing knowledges that are over a period of time, and it'll be far more valuable than actually financial contribution. Lastly, actually, sometimes is to speak when it's needed to speak, because sometimes silence is the most difficult thing to undertake, and therefore how to speak and to be an ally, where sometimes the ability of the person who's under pressure is unable to speak because of the circumstances. So those are quick things that could be done.
Thank you.
If I can add on to Hassam, one of the first things I always recommend that folks do is find an organization that's working in this space that seems to reasonably agree with you. I'm going to be biased today and say CARE Minnesota, since they're hosting us, would be one option.
That's a wise comment.
Yeah, I know how to play to a crowd. But you'll also see some other organizations that are sponsoring this listed here. Find them, sign up, and follow the activity that they're doing, because they will often know when some kind of action is needed to be taken and let you know about it. So it does two things for you. It keeps you informed, and it takes you from being a concerned individual to being part of a movement. And that's really one of the most important things possible. Second, where you have the ability to bring Muslims to speak to audiences, please use that ability. Rethink Media's research shows that the most influential speakers on behalf of the Muslim community are, surprisingly enough, Muslims. I honestly thought that was going to be different, that it would be different groups of people. But when we tested it, Khizr Khan, if you know him, he's the gentleman who at the Democratic National Committee offered to give Donald Trump a copy of his Quran. Khizr Khan is a Gold Star father. Constitution, sorry. That's why they usually have me after lunch. He needs a Quran, though. Let's put it that way. He tested out as being one of the best messengers possible. So give Muslims an opportunity to speak on behalf of themselves, and do it in a forum where you've told the crowd, look, rude questions are on the table, right? Ask what you need to ask. When we have the opportunity to explain ourselves, people can see us as human beings, and we're able to debunk things. The last thing I would ask of you is listen to the way the people impacted by Islamophobia are talking about things, and mirror what they're doing. Because another thing that Rethink Media's research shows is that the different frames, so the different ways the conversation is taking place in the media, one of the most useful ways to talk about countering Islamophobia is to talk about shared values. So you heard me earlier talking about we have this notion that everybody should be treated based on individual merit. But one of the most damaging things that allied groups have done is said that, look, if we treat Muslims badly here, they're going to turn against us, which reinforces the notion that somehow Muslims are just sort of sitting around waiting for something to set us off. So people who are genuinely trying to be helpful end up contributing to the narrative that the groups who want to hurt minorities in this country are trying to build. So if those are three immediate things, two very practical steps that you can take that are easy, don't take much time out of your day, and tremendously help.
Thank you. Rashid?
I would just like to add also, we have to also learn from our history, because as Dr. Hatem was saying, it's not about an issue of Islam or Muslim, it's an issue regarding solidarity, human rights, and justice. And if people can understand that concept, it will be much more easier for them and engage. And in Norway, we had a white nationalist, fascist, called Anders Behring Breivik, who killed 77 children on an island called Utøya. And it was they were part of the Labour Party in Norway, and he didn't go after a mosque or a masjid, and he went directly after them, and he said that they were traitors for letting the Muslim in the country at the first place. So you can see that Islamophobia can also affect the majority of society. It doesn't necessarily have to affect the Muslim community. It can also affect the majority society, or even different groups of people. So if the people understand that type of concept, then it will be much more easier. And how can they be good allies? I would say that, well, there's two options. Either you give your time or your money, but most importantly, both. Yeah. So support those organizations that actually handling this issue, or try to uplift this issue and try to make it and try to actually make a difference.
Can I add one thing?
Yes, please do.
In here, a lot of people are educators. In the summer, I take students, we have a program in Granada where we actually take them to visit the Inquisition Museum to actually problematize history in a longer period. And then we take another group of students to France to look at the immigration and refugee crisis. We take them to the Cali tunnel area where just last year there were 7,000 immigrants in there, and to problematize the history and longer, that the reason immigrants and refugees are fleeing up north, it's part of a longer history, colonial, post-colonial period, rather than thinking people just, somebody get up in chat and say, you know what, I need to go up north, right? And then compare it to why the Mexican immigration is taking place, or Latin American immigration, to look at a longer history, rather than to only think, oh, they arrived at the border, the problem is here. So this is, an educators, I think, part of it is to complicate and also give people a longer lens, so when we get them to look at the current problem, they are able to provide solutions that are real and that are sustainable.
Thank you. When I think about your reference to educators and that question of allies, I think I won't soon forget two slides that you shared. One was of that letter written by a child, and the other was about the mother who live streamed her children. And it made me feel like I could hardly breathe. And I think that there's a challenge for all of us when we think about the youngest people, who I would almost think more of as victims than anything. And how is it as educators that we think about that kind of environment in our classrooms? So I don't have the answer to that, but I will not soon forget that. There's a number of questions. I'm paraphrasing some of them. Some of them start by, "it is often said." Others start with, "I am frustrated that." Others say, "sometimes this happens." But the fundamental question is, it is often said that Muslims do not speak out enough with enough force when violent acts are committed in the name of Allah. Do you agree or do you disagree with that?
Ooh, can I take that one?
Yeah, I figured this.
That's yours.
I thought this might evoke some interesting responses.
And I say this as a person who is a spokesperson for a Muslim organization for 21 years. I was interviewed by an academic, Christopher Bale, and he was looking at press releases. And I told him, look, I've condemned terrorism so many times that I sit up in bed at night and start condemning it while I'm trying to sleep, right? But let me give you a more recent moment and then give you a little bit of additional context on that. Mike Pompeo, when he was a member of the House of Representatives, after the Boston Marathon bombing, went to the House floor and said exactly that. Muslim leadership are complicit in these attacks. I'm paraphrasing him, because they don't come out and condemn these things. So I wrote him a letter, and it's still on the internet, and it was used recently during his hearings, and that made me very proud, I have to admit. And in that letter I said, here's the time that CARE issued a condemnation, here's the time the Islamic Society of Boston issued a condemnation, down the list, right? A bunch of organizations, and the time, within hours. And what he did was the next day went back to the House floor and condemned us for just issuing condemnations instead of doing something, right? So he essentially moved the goalpost. So the response to that is fairly simple. I mentioned violent extremist groups earlier, and here's a thing to be aware of with them. I have endured, I don't know how many threats from people from the right wing, saying they're going to rape me, rape and murder me, and many combinations of the above. And I have to admit, I've become very desensitized to it, right? I'm correcting grammar half of the time in their threats. But on the other hand, ISIS put out a magazine with a picture of my former boss, who's Muslim, with a target over his face. ISIS has multiple times told people to stay away from organizations that I worked with, or to kill people that work at organizations I work with. And I always think, you know what, you may not be hearing the condemnations here, but if I'm upsetting people in Iraq and Syria, I feel like I'm doing something right. And the final point there is in 2006, a congressional office contacted us because the child of one of their constituents had been kidnapped in Iraq. And the office asked us to call for the release of that constituent. And we got on an airplane and went to Baghdad and did that call from Baghdad. Now, I can tell you, a white guy, I was wearing a suit at the time, and my boss, who was very recognizable, are not people you want sort of walking around in Baghdad looking like idiots without weapons, right? The actions have been taken. So why don't you see it? Because it's not the guy in the cave yelling death to America, right? It's the pushback, and that doesn't make it on the news. We actually, I'm sorry, this is a long answer, but
you feel pretty passionately about this.
The question comes, I am passionate. I condemn it in my sleep, right? A Fox News host one time said she invites one American leader to come on her program and condemn this stuff. So what did we do? We reached out and we said, sure, we do it all the time. Happy to do it. Oh, well, what she meant was a local American leader, not a national American leader. Okay, we'll help you find somebody. 2 days later, she goes back on TV and says, nobody took me up on my offer. So we put together a video. And this was a Fox News host. Shocking, I know. But this was a Fox News host. So we said, okay, here are the hundreds of condemnations we've issued since 9/11 and pre-9/11. Here are the actions we have taken. Here are all the @foxnews.com email addresses on our journalists list. Here are the Fox News cameras at our press conferences where we're condemning terrorism, where we're taking action against it. So where are the condemnations? In the email boxes of journalists who just aren't covering it.
Thank you. Rashid, and then back. We'll go here and then back to you, Professor.
There is actually a website called muslimcondemn.com. So, and you could read all of them condemnation on that website. But I think it's quite problematic actually to force Muslim organization, community, and individuals to actually condemn something that has nothing to do with them in the first place. And these kind of ideas are also ongoing on Europe and Scandinavia, that somehow if you don't condemn, then you're basically condoning. And it's a very actually dangerous way of expressing its Islamophobia, because for the first, number one, there's the idea of accepting and collective punishment. Like if some Muslim do something bad somewhere in this world, that you're going to be held accountable. And I don't know any other group that actually being held accountable in the same way. And so Muslims shouldn't actually, and I know that of course we condemn terrorism, of course, but there shouldn't be any force that are more or less making people to condemn terrorism, because that's a sign of Islamophobia itself.
Thank you. Professor?
Just I need make a reference. I was in a conference on Islamophobia in Sarajevo, and the British Foreign Secretary, or the ex-British Foreign Secretary Straw, gave the opening speech. And basically he called on Muslim theologians that were in attendance on how to condemn terrorism, condemn what is taking place, and so on. And after he finished, I came up for the first question. And I said, you know, Jack, I see that you are asking us to condemn. Why don't you take that role of condemning your support for the Iraq invasion that was bogus, completely without any substantiation whatsoever, instead of asking us to deal with the afterfact of the mess that you created? And why don't you ask U.S. leadership that you were in partners with, Cheney, Rumsfeld, and others? So it seemed to be that you're making a group responsibility for action that you're responsible for, rather than asking us to give a theological answer to something that is exclusively in the domain of politics. So in here, I think what we need is to completely step back from a group responsibility, in the same way that often when domestic, we say black on black violence, as if it is something inherently in black, rather than looking at the conditions. We never say white on white violence. Most whites are killed by whites, but we never problematize it in that way. So part of it, we need to challenge the assumptions behind the question, rather than take the question and try to act in a defensive way. Violence exists, extremists exist, and so on, but we don't call 1.2 billion to apologize or to engage in a whole systematic process of condemnation.
Thank you. We have a number of questions that we're not going to be able to get to, and one of the things I love about having questions written on cards is that now we have them, we know what you're thinking about. We'll share them with the conference organizers and also perhaps with panelists and speakers this afternoon, so people know what's on your minds. But let me ask this again. It's sort of an aggregated question, and I will ask each of you to be very brief, and it's a tough question. It's going to sound remarkably simple, but tough. When we think about this conference theme, challenging Islamophobia, what's one thing, just one thing, that gives you hope? That gives you hope about this?
Well, I'm always hopeful. The fact that everybody is in here in this room is
There
very
you go.
hopeful.
That's awesome.
Just look around. and people taking their time. You know, you're not being paid, I assume, to come in here, that you take the issue seriously. There's a whole bunch of people that say Islamophobia is a hoax, right? Including our commander-in-chief that is sitting. So the fact that people are in this room taking the issue seriously, they're connecting it to a variety of struggles. If you work on immigration, Islamophobia is part of your work. If you're working anti-racism type of work, you're in there. If you're working on gender issues, you're there. So again, what we need is to how to reclaim back civil society. And I think we have the 2018 election staring us in the face. We need to push back like no other time in order to claim our society. Islamophobia is not about me as a Muslim. It's about all of us and what type of society we want and what type of future for this country. I believe that the future horizon is for all of us. There are some people that are peddling in fear in order to get seats of power, and we need to shine the light on them and get them out of their fear and not allow them to stoke the fear for people who are otherwise decent people that will actually go across and speak and address other people. And I think that's the task that's ahead of us. And I think I'm optimistic with the type of people that are here and also across the world. I'm seeing people all across the world trying to engage in it. I was in Sweden. Now, just a note on American history. In the 20th century, the United States recruited 1 million Swedes to make America white again during the 20th century, during the Chinese exclusionary period. And there was actually an archive in Sweden. 1 million Swedes made it to the United States. And you remember when President Trump wanted to bring Norwegian in, the Norwegians say, thank you, we're comfortable where we are. So that points to the changes that are taking place.
Thank you. Rashid, and then Corey will give you the last word.
That's why I feel like I'm in Sweden every time I come to Minneapolis. But one thing I would say is there's a new generation that's are very vocal. They are not compromising and with their identity, with their beliefs, and you know, the belief of justice. And there's a new generation that are actually wants to see a change, not only in America but across the world. So that gives me some hope. And they have actually the tools, the analysis that I didn't have when I was 15 or 16. So that actually gives me hope.
Great thing. The fact that you have 5,000 members in your organization gives me hope too.
Yeah.
Corey.
And thank you for that. I didn't want to jump in, even though I have lots of reasons to be hope. I just didn't want to keep being the first guy answering the question. Looks bad. So two things. One, in 2010, Oklahoma passed an anti-Islam bill. We'll talk about that in the next panel that's going to happen soon. We sued them 2 days later, and a lot of people were telling me, don't rock the boat, don't rock the boat, don't worry about it, it's okay. What I loved is that other communities came forward, particularly in this case, the Catholic and the Jewish communities. And this is high-powered lawyers who were just outraged by the action and were offering services for free. How can you not feel hopeful when that kind of thing happens? That's just the greatest thing in the world to me. And also just, you know, based on that experience, Catholics were condemned. There was a Catholic president, right? We're next.
We already had one, right?
Well, don't undermine my good point.
Let's again thank these remarkable panelists. I believe you have a short break. Is there somebody in the back that wants to give a shout out for an adjusted starting time? I figure we could claim this time because we started a little late. So we should be in the next session by 10:45? You're making the call? 10:45. Okay, great. Enjoy your break. Again, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Wow.